I'd like to welcome you to this morning breakfast banter in conversation to open the battle for the media strand, entitled Media Bashing Live. My name's David Bowden, and aside from being your chair this morning, I'm also the Battle Satellite Coordinator at the Institute of Ideas and TV columnist for Spiked Online. So I thought if there's one thing I could try and do this morning to set us up for the media strand is to try and give the opportunity for the media to bite back a little bit. And not just Fleet Street, of who we hear an awful lot of. We hear a lot of grandstanding from the importance of the big newspapers and the tabloid newspapers who need to be regulated, the importance and the value of the free press of Fleet Street. But I wanted to give Grub Street more of a chance to fight back. Since we're in spitting distance of it here, I'm asking some of the grubbiest hack and dedicated newshounds that I could find. These are not people who are the big stars on their 100 grand columns in the national newspaper, but they are thoroughly experienced journalists who have worked across a number of different fields and have a lot of different perspectives. So we'll be trying to hear what they have to say on the topic. Just to briefly introduce them, we have Sean Bell, who actually came here this morning with newsprint on his hands, which was a nice touch, but he's got extensive experience in the local and trade newspapers as a copy editor, writer and journalist, so much so that when I sent him the blurb for this session, he sent it back to me with a list of stylistic corrections and grammar. But he's also the co-founder of the Brighton Salon, a monthly debating forum. Ed Dorrell, furthest to my right, is perhaps best known and loved for his hard-hitting reportage for his first job, heating and ventilating news. But since that peak, he has been a full-time journalist for the Architects Journal and also is now comment and features editor at the Times Educational Supplement. To my far left, Jo Phillips is somewhat of the kind of viper in the grass of this discussion, of the fact that she's actually a former spin doctor as well as being a journalist, having been Paddy Ashdown's press secretary and also worked on Live 8 in media relations. But aside from being a press officer and an award-winning journalist, she's also a Middle East rally driver, a West Ham fan, and generally always good value at the Battle of Ideas. And last but not least, we have Jason Walsh, who is island correspondent for the CS Monitor, also known as the Christian Science Monitor. But just to make it very clear, he is not actually a Christian Scientist, which I'm sure he'll explain what that newspaper is and what that means. He is also a PhD student in philosophy, looking at news and journalism. But yeah, I'm just going to sort of just put a couple of sort of questions to the panel. You know, very much in the kind of, sort of discussion around Leveson, it has been, you know, as Hugh Grant kind of termed it quite effectively, the good press versus the baddies. The good press of the Guardian and the Independent, who didn't need regulating, and the bad press of the Sun and the News of the World and the likes. Which one of you guys generally? Are you the goodies or the baddies in the local trade press?
I think the press is as good as the audience that it is talking to and responding to. I think the Guardian sits on its high horse of smuggery and complacency. And whilst Nick Davies may well be commended for, you know, pursuing News International, my own view is that was a battle based on snobbery as much as anything, and it was a story that was of little interest until the Millie Dowler smoking gun, if you like, or smoking phone that turned out not to be a smoking phone. And I think there are a lot of questions about how the Guardian came to get that evidence. And I'm not a great fan.
So are you pushing for more? Are you signing off the media strand by pushing for more regulation?
No, absolutely not. No, absolutely not.
Where do we stand as the TES? Well, I think all journalists stand foot in both camps, really. I think there is a grubby end to most journalists' instincts, but most also, I think, see themselves as campaigners and a positive influence in large part.
Is that necessarily a good thing that they're campaigners? I mean, it's kind of, in a way, journalists are supposed to report the news dispassionately.
No, I mean campaigning within the context of journalism, as in a positive influence upon society, or at least the sector on which they're reporting. Yeah,
but but that may be, that just may be straightforward journalism, yes, perhaps, rather than the campaigning type. Because actually, the Guardian is a campaigning newspaper.
Yeah, just to give a very small example, The Guardian is a campaigning newspaper on all sorts of terribly right-on issues. Yeah. And yet, if you go on The Guardian jobs page, you will find any number of advertisements for unpaid interns which seems to me a total contradiction in what they are campaigning for. And in this, in the same way they campaign for, less consumerism, less materialism, all the rest of it, and at the same time have a magazine that sells or advertises ridiculously overpriced socks and soap.
I don't think there's a section of journalism or titles or the media that you can say is bad, and there's this bad section and then there's this good section. There's good and bad journalism, but it just goes right the way up from the local to through the regional and to the national in every form, whether it's print or broadcast, radio, TV. I would say, for example, that if you look at the BBC local news, that is, with the odd exception, it's probably some of the worst journalism in the world. It's completely boring. It's not the news from where you are now, like they say. It's usually 60 miles away, and it's about something that nobody cares about.
How they managed that, how BBC London manages to make London seem like a boring city is a real achievement. It's a city, it's one of the world's greatest cities, 9 million people, and yet, yeah, you're right. It's extraordinary achievement.
Luckily, I don't get BBC London. I get BBC South something.
3 counties, I think you were lucky to get.
Yes, I live in Brighton and get the news from Dorset whenever I want it. It's so there's good and bad journalism everywhere. But I'd also question the idea that it's the tabloid end or the local bouncy tabloid end that's the worst thing. I used to love working for a bouncy local tabloid. We used to do brothel knocks. We used to make our excuses and leave. We'd go to the pub and try and buy a gun. It was all, well, it's not as much fun as it sounds, actually, but it was...
You may want to explain to the audience what a brothel knock is, because they might get slightly the wrong idea from what you...
I think they probably can work it out, Dave.
Okay.
As long as you make your excuses
just in case that they have any...
It's, as long as you do leave, obviously, it is... But the point is that whether that's campaigning, I suppose it is in a sense. It's maybe not a long campaign like The Guardian would run that nobody gets involved with, but at least for a few days or a week, everyone is concerned, that there is a brothel there and who might be working at it. Everybody is concerned, about the this or that that's going to get built, not going to get built, or is a danger to the public health. All these things. The thing about all journalism is if you take it, all of it, it's what we all know. It is all life should be there. It should be, whether it's about, whether you're writing for Electrical Review or one of those joke things you see on Have I Got News for You. All life should be there, and unfortunately the way in which journalism is going now, the way in which it's being attacked now, particularly by the Leveson sort of idea of everybody conform to kind of local BBC news standards, I think that's less of life will be there. The less it will matter.
I must tell you, audience, because you can't see this, but I'm really, really impressed by Sean's shorthand, which I haven't seen the like of for a long time. But I think that's a good illustration of actually how journalists are trained. And people think that being a journalist is fine and it's easy, and I think, social media and Twitter and the so-called citizen journalist has made everybody think they have got a story and they can create, present or write a story. And I think, one of the problems is the economics of the media, and that goes across print and broadcast. And we shouldn't forget broadcast, because a lot of the debates that we're going to have over the course of the day talk about the press, and they talk about the tabloid press, but they're not talking about television, including local television, which is possibly even worse than some BBC local radio. But, where are the specialist correspondents who cover Whitehall or who cover the courts or who cover industry? I mean, when I started out 100 years ago, there were more industrial correspondents along Fleet Street, and we knew every pub to go to and how we could work out who could follow which particular dispute, because there were so many going on at that particular time. There are very few specialists now, but what you've got are incredibly overpaid columnists. But you haven't got specialists who know their story. And I think, as you're saying, and coming from a sort of specialist trade background, that's now become very niche. So general journalism, I don't think there are the skills, and certainly in the lectures and the classes I've ever been involved in with media students, the lack of interest and the lack of knowledge and the lack of curiosity is absolutely staggering. And if you haven't got those things, you're never going to make a good journalist.
Yeah, I think it is a very odd time for the media, particularly with the sort of professionalisation of journalism and journalism degrees, which is really just a way of how we can't be bothered training you. So we'll hive this off to the universities, who are quite happy to cash the cheque.
Train them badly.
Train them badly, yeah. And try and pretend it's a degree, so we'll stick a bit of media theory, a bit of sort of Chomsky analysis, so the self-loathing can go in right at the start, you know. But the decline of absolute specialists is probably right now a function of economics, as you say. But I also think there's a problem more widely in society. There's a kind of hole. You can go about your life now without reading a newspaper, and it will make absolutely no difference. And it's almost as if the news has very little purchase, unless there's an enormous rolling story right now, which we get 24-hour updates on, like Jimmy Savile or whatever the latest outrage is. But most people's, the purpose of a newspaper, the difference between a newspaper and a magazine, like news, it's just the plural, an archaic plural for new, and the archetypal newspapers are sort of very Enlightenment notion where you sit down in the morning and you open this enormous broadsheet and it tells you all about the Crimean War and where stocks are going, and that's the kind of engagement in the world that they were aimed at, and the modern newspaper developed out of that. Now, do you really need to know? Does it matter? I think it's tragic, but you don't.
I still want to know why you think that's happened. I don't understand. You can make a fact that it's true, but how has that come to be?
Well, I can answer, but it'll be a very loaded question, politically loaded answer. I think that journalism is fundamentally about politics. It's political, and I think that the political sphere has shrunk. Without wanting to sound like an inch-tall version of Jürgen Habermas, I think that the bourgeois public sphere is in retreat. And I say that because I work for a bourgeois newspaper.
I agree with you that public sphere is something that is in retreat in some sense, that we are all connected to it, that there are big titanic struggles between ideologies, that those no longer exist. But in another sense, whether it's bourgeois or not, the public sphere has definitely got much, much bigger.
That was just being sarcastic.
Yeah, I mean, the way in which it's got bigger, though, we understand it as a series of like little discrete things, as if you could set up imagine every title on the internet or every title of a magazine on a newsstand, and then just put them all together, and that's the public. And I don't think the public is like that. I think the public is actually, I think I'd give the readers and the viewers and listeners a lot more credit than that. Yeah. Okay, so all of them under 30 or something don't want to pay for what we do anymore because they can get so much free. But you can understand them not really being cared about the news, considering what the news is of. It doesn't take me long to read much of the Times, the Independent, these days, because the news that it's of. I mean, look at the Tory alarm over number 10.
Honestly,
Ticketgate was the last thing, I think. George
not another gate, please.
Sunday newspapers are a particularly bad example. But, I mean, this is probably the thinnest of the Sundays, and that's too thick. You don't need more than 20 pages. You could have a 20-page newspaper that can tell you everything you need to know about the news in the day, if it was proper news.
Yeah, but the Sundays don't even aim to do proper news, do they?
No, but I mean...
they're lifestyle magazines in large part.
Well, I think that all newspapers have become magazines.
Well, that's true,
yeah. I think that's the road they're going down.
That's the internet, though.
Yeah. But I think there's been this sort of this desperate attempt to try and engage with the public, which comes from Whitehall and Westminster and seeps through the BBC and through the newspapers and every sort of media outlet. And so what you end up is, I want to know what real people think. Frankly, I don't. I can get that by talking to people on the bus or the tube, or listening to phone-ins, or talking to any, living human being that you come across. What I want from news is some expert analysis and some reporting. I don't actually necessarily want opinions, and I think we've now got into a rather dangerous sphere, particularly, and again, I go back to broadcast. This may happen, so let's have somebody on to speculate about what's going to happen, then it happens, and then let's have somebody analysing what's happened, and then let's have some ordinary people. Once upon a time you had something like the budget, and it would be analysed properly. I'm going to sound like an old fogey here, but, analysed properly by economists. Mm-hmm. But now we go and it's usually the same sort of, single parent, pensioner, and it's like, frankly, who gives a shit? What's the point of having journalism if you're just going to have endless parades of people sitting in their front rooms? That's not.
But journalism. That's it. I wouldn't be as hard on opinion journalism as you are. I mean, I agree there is an unbelievable oversupply of it, And one of the problems is, on the one hand, you have star columnists being paid 100,000 to vomit out opinions. On the other hand, if I am writing an opinion piece for a paper and they're going to pay me something between nothing and 85 quid, I'm going to spend approximately half an hour on that story.
Yeah.
That's what you're getting. I'm not wasting my time with it because you're not paying me properly. And the same thing applies to reporting as well. I mean, rates haven't gone up in years, so people are sitting reporting from their desks. Everything's done. Picking up the
It's a fundamental
phone.
truth that, you know, news staffs, reporting staff, newsrooms have shrunk.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
hugely.
And they're in
And it becomes
industrial states,
self-fulfilling.
particularly, like for the local press, which I came up through the locals and the trade.
Yes, I don't know.
We were all moved out to industrial estates, so we're covering places that we can't even see.
And you can't get to.
Yeah.
And you know, there is no understanding. So you end up just talking to other journalists.
Yeah.
So you know, you just go round and round in circles. And I think, you know, to go back to sort of industrial reporting, which I, you know, care very much about, you know, I think the BBC has got they don't call him a labour correspondent, they call him an industrial correspondent now. But, you know, if now is not the time that you need somebody who understands that there is more than a winter of discontent looming, goodness me, how many times have we heard that, and it's a simple argument between the trade unions and whichever government happens to be in power. That is really rubbish journalism.
Isn't it odd, though, that the BBC does have a couple of sort of superstars in that area? It has Peston, who's become very popular,
Yeah.
and it has the other guy who supports Occupy and sort of flies around the world to...
Paul Mason.
Paul
Yeah.
Mason, yeah.
On
It's
the-
really cheap, though, isn't it, to just have the media investigate itself, and then, I mean, at the moment we got is it Panorama's investigating Newsnight at the moment over Jimmy Savile,
Yeah.
and there'll probably be a documentary about that. So eventually, somehow the whole BBC might be taken over by an
Well,
investigation
it's
of
like a really,
itself.
really sad old Douglas Adams joke about people sitting around making documentaries about themselves. It's actually true. You know?
It's stunning.
Okay, shall I,
Let's
I'll
ask
give
the
the
people.
opportunity for,
Yeah,
I'm going to
yeah.
ask the people for their thoughts.
I am distressed with actually the quality of investigative journalism in this country because although I am a member of the public, have researched one issue incredibly intensely, can I interest the media in it? No.
My father was a correspondent for most of the post-war period, so he saw the sort of shift in journalism. The thing that upset him most is not Leveson, although he does get very upset about Leveson, was Hutton. And I'd be interested to see what the panel think, because he was never an expert, but he was a very good journalist, and I know that was because of the close relationship he had with his political sources. But the thing that seems to profoundly change to me is that journalism's relationship with its sources now is a sort of mutual, cynical relation. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, rather than the relationship that my father had, which I know was entirely different. It was about really getting very close to people, probably too close to people, to use their understanding in order to inform his journalism. So what's the impact of Hutton in terms of changing human relations in the media?
Hi, my name's Penelope Gibbs. I worked for the BBC as a producer mainly for about 12 years in radio, and now I've started a new charity called Transform Justice to make for a better justice system in this country. And I think that what I've discovered after leaving the BBC is that probably 95% of the stories out there are never reported. That if you're in the world of like justice or courts or whatever, you hear of stories which are good stories, I know they're good, all the time. And one of the problems with the news media is there's a kind of herd mentality whereby if somebody else has got a story, that is the story. And so everybody writes about the same stories and doesn't go out looking or going out of the office to just sit down and chat with people to find the other stories. So, for instance, I think a huge missed story was the child abuse in Rotherham. You know, over 10 years, I can't believe that some sniffing around in that town would not have indicated something was going wrong. But in the end, it was only the justice process which brought it into the media's attention.
Well, my question to the panellists, isn't this problem sort of going to solve itself because the public are simply not going to be willing to pay for news they're going to get for free on the internet anyway? So isn't the media going to have to sort of transform into a type of journalism that's focused more on analysis and on this additional value that you cannot find for free on the web? And doesn't that sort of also mean that journalists would sort of pursue journalism more as a postgrad course than as an undergrad degree necessarily to get that specialism?
First of all, you are going to have to pay. Tough luck. I don't know what kind of genius came up with the idea of giving away everything for free. It seems to be working so well for all those newspapers, so that's going to stop.
And Google.
Yeah, but you're right. Print news, or even any kind of written journalism, is going to have to specialise in analysis. I don't think it requires postgraduate training, though. But it would be good if there were specialists, if people who really knew about economics. I often wonder. I'm Irish, so I can't really speak about a lot of the sort of direct issues of what's going on here. But there's a couple of trade newspapers in Ireland, like Irish Medical Times, and I often wonder who writes for these papers. I mean, is it doctors? Because journalists don't get paid enough. But you really want someone who understands medicine, surgery, to be writing for those papers. So you'd want to be paying salaries in line with what you would get in medicine. But I'm sure they don't. Going backwards, the lady was talking about court reporting and other things. Well, I can't speak to the investigative side, but I have friends who sit in courts on a freelance basis and see what they can pick up and try and sell the stories to local radio, to local newspapers, and occasionally to the nationals. It really depends on the content of the stories. There are a lot of good stories out there, and there aren't a lot of journalists covering them. There aren't a lot of journalists on beats. There aren't a lot of journalists investigating things. There are a lot of journalists sitting in newsrooms, and there are a lot of journalists desperately sitting in courts, hoping that they're going to get a story today. But there's no one paying them a salary. I don't get a salary. There's far too many freelancers. Question before that was, remind me again.
Hutton.
Well, you just hit the nail on the head there. Well, I mean, there was a problem with source capture, and you did get the odd occasional journalist who had no contact with sources, legendary figures like the American Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone. But of course, I.F. Stone was like just one of those immaculate sort of figures on who was able to do that. The rest of us would do well to cultivate sources more and stop relying on I know it's a really boring complaint about press releases, but there is truth in it.
I do sympathise with the idea, what you were saying about the Rotherham child abuse. There is always stories. The reason that they're not being covered is partly economic and partly kind of cultural. We have far less journalists being paid for what they do. They are not any longer sitting in well-appointed newsrooms with lots of information coming in directly from the public. They're mainly sitting at computer terminals, and they're supposed to be producing sort of 1,000 words an hour. They're processing news releases. A couple of years ago, it turned out that people on BBC Online had to produce a story every 5 minutes, and that's why there were so many mistakes upon it. Under those circumstances, you are not really going to be phoning round all your best sources. You may not even develop a contacts book, which has got the local police chief and the doctor and the coroner and all the other kind of people that you need. It's not because journalists don't want to do these things. It's because they're put into a kind of a culture where if you're working as a salaried person on somebody's news desk, they're very much telling you what you're supposed to be going to look for, what the story's supposed to be. And if you're working as a freelancer, you've got to chase around what people want. And you can't afford to just sort of go out on spec investigating stuff. So yeah, we need to change the culture. And so the thing is, these problems can't all be solved by the media. They reflect really big problems, in the whole of society, and the way, not just the way that the media's funded and financed, like the business plan that media is run on newspapers and in TV as well, isn't working anymore.
I mean, there are cultural problems, certainly. I mean, I could speak about the education pack, as we affectionately call it, the correspondent, the education editors from all the major dailies. Well, there used to be ones on the Mirror and the Sun, but they've all been fired. And there's one education editor on the Guardian, one on the Times, one on the Independent, etc. They go round as a pack, and they agree. I hope I'm not giving away too many secrets. They agree on the line that they're going to write that day. The main reason for that is a mixture of resourcing, but it's also the culture of these papers. They're a real. It actually talks to the phone hacking thing, the power of the news desks on the nationals. They'd rather get the same line as their competitor than get a different story, because they're terrified of missing the story that their competitors got. So there's absolutely no creativity at all amongst those people. Some of them are very fine journalists, actually, but they just don't have the time or the culture to do the kind of journalism they'd like to do.
Okay. The sources thing that the lady up there talked about in relation to your father, we have got Julian Assange, WikiLeaks. Bizarrely, he was just a source. But he became, or is to some people, this fantastic hero. He was a source. And, sources are always, in my experience anyway, slightly odd and slightly obsessive, and that's why you need to cultivate them, but they are not journalists. And I think, you know, to go to the point of 95% of stories, like you, I mean, I have had sleepless nights and, you know, been almost in tears at stories that don't get covered, but I think it was ever thus. I worked in the Middle East. I mean, Dave said I drove rallies. I did that, but I was actually working out there. You know, and at the time that I was out there in Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, The Guardian had more people in America, more correspondents, paid correspondents in America, than in the whole of the Middle East. Now, you know, how can that possibly be right? And the answer is, it's not, if you want to understand the world. But it's a lot easier, isn't it, to talk about a country where we can relate to it and they talk the same language, and, you know, we can sort of pretend to be terribly intellectual about what it's going to mean to us. And I think, again, this whole business about investigation, if you really, really want to find out something, you will go and find out. You know, with all the things that everybody else has said, which I agree with, about the cutbacks and the lack of specialism and the way that, you know, lack of resources. But if you really want to be a journalist, it is the curiosity that drives you, that makes you want to get to the bottom of something. And I think that hunger for getting to the truth is very sadly lacking, because people would actually, it's easier to sit at home, write a column and get paid for, you know, your opinions on 50 Shades of Grey.
Foreign news is my area, or it has become my area by default, and the very strange thing about it is that no one cares, and I really find that distressing.
No one cares at all.
They care about disasters
Yeah.
and wars, and that's it. And the news just sort of zips around the globe from horror to horror, but you don't learn about the world we live in. And unfortunately, it's I'm speaking of the American press, all of the sort of second-tier big Americans, big city newspapers have closed their foreign bureaus. The Orange County Register, which has recently reinvested in print, is going to hire new journalists and all the rest of it. It's a circulation of 300,000. It's no small paper. You go onto its website, click on foreign or world, and everything's AP Wire. Baltimore Sun's all AP Wire. Boston Globe all takes it from the New York Times. So basically, Washington Post is scaled back. You're left with the New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, a couple of other papers doing foreign. Nobody else does.
I'm Andrew Calcutt, academic. I want to put in a good word for the old-fashioned general reporter. I mean, I hear what people are saying about the desirability of specialisms and all that, but I think there is a bit too much of a readiness on the part of journalists not to be journalists, not to be reporters. So my old schoolmate, Roger Harrabin, wants to be the BBC's environmental analyst. He doesn't want to be just a plain reporter. And I think that general role, David Randall called it the universal reporter, is one that's, strangely absent, and we're much the worse off for its absence. Where have they all gone? Well, they've gone down the same plug hole as our public life has largely disappeared into, I think. There was a time not that long ago when you didn't have to have a weekend battle of ideas, there just was one, continually, all the time, which is why you had to have people who did eventually specialise as Labour correspondents, but only because they'd been bloody good general reporters in the first place. I think the question for the likes of us is, well, how do we respond to this, and what, if anything, can journalism do to renew something like public life? And obviously it can't, as Sean says, can't do the whole job. But there was a time 300 years ago when Addison and Steele and The Spectator catalysed the public. They didn't invent it, but they catalysed the public into existence. And it would be good to think that reporting could play a similar role today.
Quick thing, it does sound, this session was called media bashing, and you seem to have been doing so much bashing of yourselves. You just think, my God, what are you, suicidal or something?
The self-loathing of the profession.
And the only other bashing I've heard is that you bashing the public. Caricaturing the public is somehow there to blame for wanting, you know, the crap stories that are often delivered. So I'd like to know a little bit more, especially in the wake of Leveson, you know, what we have to defend and what we want the press to be. What is your vision for what it should be, rather than whinging?
The problem's not the public, the problem is us. The problem is the product we're serving to the public. It's not that the public want crap news and we have to produce this awful news and we're too good for it. It's that we're not doing our job properly, and I'm not even sure there's a purchase in society. I do think that there's, this thing about industrial and labour correspondence keeps coming up, and it's really hard to ignore it, that isn't as important to an area of life as it used to be.
A lot of it goes to education, and I will say, in defence of media studies, that Andrew's course at the University of East London is the only media studies course that is actually I've ever come across that is sensible, because it's practical. I never thought there'd be a day in my life when I didn't read a paper every day, and as one of you said earlier, we don't now. We read it online and we cherry pick. And yet we've got all this information out there, and yet we know so little. We know so little about foreign affairs. We know so little about what's going on in other countries. We know so little about what's going on in court hearings. We know so little, as Sean said, about what's going on locally, because local papers can't afford anymore to send reporters to sit in court or council meetings every day and pick up on stuff. So I think there is a crisis in the industry, as there are in so many industries, but I think a lot of it is about education, and it's actually creating the curiosity within young people to know more about what's going on, which is why things like Battle of Ideas and Debating Matters are so important, because you can see there's a real appetite for it. It's very difficult, isn't it, to defend 8 pages on Simon Cowell's latest exploits when Syria's in flames. But, we're all human, and lots of people would rather read about Simon Cowell than something difficult in Syria. I think we have to try and reinvent it. And I don't think it's a whinge particularly, Kerry. I think it's a sadness that the quality has gone, and that lots of people don't see journalism as a vocation based on the things I've said before about, a desire to find the truth or to find things out, that it's a job that is seen as glamorous or exciting or, all of those things, and if you're lucky, you'll end up as one of the overpaid columnists.
I would defend 8 pages on Simon Cowell while Syria burns, actually. I think you have to. Firstly, all life has to be there. It has to be about, not just because the readers want this kind of thing instead of that kind of thing. It's just that I know, in this day and age, the way that the kind of journalism industry is funded and the way that it's in collapse because of its relationship with a collapsing kind of sense of political authority, that people are now much more concerned about what is closest to them, what touches them. I don't think the media is responsible for a kind of a whole emotional vocabulary that we have now, but they certainly kind of do encourage it. You can't really blame the media for everything, but the media also can't solve all of these problems that are in society. The kind of media reflects society. We are all a bit more emotional. We're all a bit more inward-looking. We are all less concerned with what's going on in the Middle East than we used to be. Mind you, we used to think that because we thought mad Arabs would blow up the world.
Yeah,
now we don't think that.
Do we?
We think they'll just blow up themselves, so we're not so bothered. Or maybe we should blow them up a bit to stop them blowing up. That's the kind of... It's sunk to that. I don't blame people for not wanting to read the kind of drivel that comes out of the Middle East at the moment by Western correspondents. And the kind of often quite moving and interesting emotional investigation of ourselves, which isn't necessarily narcissistic, that we do when we contemplate things like why we like the X Factor or who won it or something.
There's just one final point I'd make, Dave, that is the growth of media management, and it doesn't matter, whether you're a spin doctor in Westminster or you're the head of corporate social responsibility for Starbucks. Everything is predicated on media management, and I think that makes the job for journalists, for all the reasons that we've said, a lot harder.
I was going to make exactly that point.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. No. I completely agree. I think while the press has been damned almost universally over the last few years, even with Hutton, the fact that that there is such a strong media management philosophy within government and within all its quangos is really very, very bad. It's pervasive, actually. But with regard to the future, someone was talking about what we're going to do about it. I think, there's a fetishisation in newspapers, as we see here, of print. And we have to get over that. We really have to. Print is going to die. It doesn't matter what it's about. It doesn't matter what platform we're on. What we've got to get to is a point, as you say, that we're people are paying for quality journalism, and it doesn't matter what medium it's on.
Journalists aren't necessarily the best people to come up with new business models. For
No, I
industries.
completely
They're
agree,
probably
yeah.
one of the last people you should ask.
No.
In fact, they're not the people. The media can't solve all the problems of the world. Neither is it responsible for them. And I guess we wait for some East Coast whiz kid to come along and say, here's how you finance.
Well, have you been following what's been going on in Germany? The Germans are about to pass a law that means that Google have to pay the newspapers for every link that they post.
Can we thank the panel for just getting us started for that?